Part 1, Approaches to Fairness. In this section, we're going to do a conceptual survey or introduction to some foundational notions that underpin our ideas of fairness, or where fairness comes from, or why, when we discuss it, what are the philosophical roots of this concept. So in this section, we're going to talk about human dignity. We're going to talk about theories of fairness in terms of outcome and opportunity. We're going to talk about political economy. And the reason we're going to do that is we're going to talk about fairness in the world. So we're going to talk a lot about context of fairness and how important understanding the context is. Just say at the outset that the aim of this is not to have a deep understanding of fairness, but actually just to get an introduction to some core concepts and to use these core concepts as a point of departure for your own inquiry and to think more deeply about these concepts and where they come from. So let's start off and think about, if you will, the most foundational concept that underpins what we understand as what it means to be human and why we should even care about equality. So let me start off and by saying that human dignity is this idea that all human beings, all people, have the same moral value. They have an inviolable moral value, and that we should respect that. So it's a foundational idea which is universally applicable. And what I mean by universally applicable is we're not concerned about the dignity of a person is not dependent on their gender. It's not dependent on their creed. It's not dependent on their racial or geographic origin. It's not dependent on the language that they speak, and so on and so forth. So we're applying this concept universally. All human beings, all people have human dignity, are dignified, have the same moral value. Importantly, we're also applying this across time. So we're saying that someone who lived 500 years ago and somebody who's going to live in 500 years' time, and so on and so forth, has the same moral value. So it's not context bound, it's not dependent on time or space, it's truly universal. Now, this idea of human dignity, in order to give dignity to the human, we have to think about what is it to be human and what constitutes a human. So here we have to talk about this concept or the idea of an agent or someone having agency. So here we think about rational and free entities. Now, it's not that when someone is being rational, they are human, or when someone is acting freely, they are human. I can still be irrational and still be considered human. But what it is rather the capacity to, or the potential of rationality and freedom that underpins our notion of agency, or what it means to be an agent. So that's really what we're referring to. Now, where does the morality come from this? So we're saying that human beings have dignity. We're saying that a human is a person or an entity which is rational and free. So the moral obligation is respect for personhood. So respect for personhood is just to say respect for the rationality and freedom of that individual, respect for their status as a human, and the dignity that comes with that. So respect for personhood is, if you will, rooting our, or begin, is the point of departure, or the first part by which we make our move towards our concepts of fairness and so on and so forth. So this appeals to the concept or the idea that all humans are essentially the same. Now, if all human beings are the same and we have respect for personhood, then all human beings are equal and we have respect for other human beings' human dignity. Or we should consider all human beings with such dignity or being dignified. So if all human beings are the same and all human beings are effectively then equal, then we're talking about a concept of humanity. So that's how we're able to move from human dignity in terms of an individual to humanity, which is a kind of collective concept, all whilst premised on the idea that all people in that community, humanity, are equal, are effectively at their core the same. So we're going to move from this concept, which is very abstract, and I should say, as I said, it's a very deep concept. There's lots of history on this, to more, let's say, concrete terms, which is, okay, all human beings are the same, and we have to have respect for human beings' dignity. But what does it mean to say that we have to treat someone fairly, or treat people fairly, or persons fairly, and so on and so forth? The word treat is a very interesting term, because it suggests that there's a necessary relationship between other human beings, so that we're living collectively, we're living together. And this is a very important concept. And I put the image of the front page or the first page of Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan there on the right, because he was interested in when you form a state, and they were very much in those formative periods when he was writing this text. Where are our concepts of how should an individual within that state be treated? How should a group within that state be treated? How can we justify creating that state? So this idea of mediating or solving the problem of how we can live together, or what is it right to treat people like when living in a collective, assumes a collective. It assumes, and I'm using the word state here, it assumes a kind of structure of commonality or structure within which we all agree to, or we are, if you're compelled to be part of. It assumes a state. And a state is a collective of individuals, a collective of groups and so on. We talk about limited resources or resource allocation within that context, mechanisms of exchange, so that can be like banking and so on and so forth, cash, money, and legal recourse. So we can think of kind of a system that mediates those exchanges or those organizations. So notice how we've gone from a very abstract concept of human dignity and equality to now talking about, exchange of resources, mechanisms of exchange, legal recourse, and so on and so forth. And that's what I mean by the ethical as political and the political as ethical. We're moving where, even though our concepts of how do we collectively exist are dependent on our ethical and moral concepts, there's still a lot more, there's a much more sophisticated and concrete discussion to take place when we're thinking about how to treat others within this kind of collective state. And most of our concepts of fairness, or our discussions of fairness, very much come from this context. We're thinking about how to treat people within this collective state, or this state per se. So now we can talk about theories of fairness. And generally speaking, we talk about two concepts of fairness. That's where our literature has kind of moved towards. On the one hand, we've got a concept of fairness which is outcome dependent. On the other hand, we've got an opportunity dependent. So in this slide, I'm going to be talking about outcome. So what do we mean by outcome, or equality of outcome? So in this concept, we're talking about fairness is equality of outcome. That's how we're defining it. And what do we mean by outcome? So outcome could be things like, and I've given the example there of employment. So that means how many people are being employed, who's being employed, university admissions. So how many people are getting into university, from which demographics are they getting into university, is, ensuring that there's an outcome parity in those contexts. Now, two major questions are what and who. So the first, about what's being made equal, is very important. So in abstract, equality of outcome, okay, sure. I've given two case studies, but really we need to dig down and think very specifically about what's being made equal. So economic wealth, so you can think there's, in the 20th century, there was a whole political philosophy and political movements that thought that economic wealth, outcome equality should have been prioritized. And then there's other concepts of equal, such as, there are certain social goods which people think should be made equal, things like housing allocation, educational allocation, health allocation, and so on and so forth. So what's being made equal is very important. It's very key when we're thinking about questions of outcome, and it's something that's very non-trivial. Second question, about who's being made equal. So what's our basic unit that we're basing our equality of outcome on? So are we interested in individuals? Are we interested in family units? Are we interested in communities? And you can see just how important that distinction is. You can imagine an individual concept of outcome fairness or outcome equality, and you can compare that to a community where you might say that person belongs to a particular demographic, or, I don't know, religious group or something like that. And thinking about equality of outcome as the group or as the individual makes a big difference as well. And the third thing is that, okay, when we have equality of outcome, we need to have some kind of redistributive mechanisms. So what is a redistributive mechanism? So let's say we have a circumstance where we know that the outcome is not equal, is unequal, and we want to make it fair, in quotes, defining fairness in terms of outcome. There are a number of ways in which we can do that. One way is through welfare. So that's a mechanism where you might think about taxing people who earn more money, or have greater resources, and redistributing them to people who are worse off. You can think of this, for example, in the case of healthcare outcomes in the NHS, and so on. And then we've got positive discrimination, which is to say, okay, in certain contexts, if we understand and we see a circumstance which is particularly unfair or particularly unacceptable from an outcome perspective, we can do positive discrimination where we pick an individual or a community which we find has been discriminated against or in terms of outcome fairness, and we positively or we actively seek to put them in certain positions and so on and so forth. So the second concept is in terms of our theories of fairness, and this goes in opposition to our concept of equality of opportunity, equality of outcome, is the equality of opportunity. So here we're talking about procedural fairness or opportunity fairness, or procedural equality or opportunity equality. And this very much goes in opposition to the outcome. Here, we're not interested in the outcomes, but we're interested in the process. So it's very important that all people or all are treated the same. Again, we have to define, are we talking about individuals are being treated the same or groups being treated the same? But it's very much about the treatment and the process by which decisions are made. So we think about criminal justice, recruitment, grading, and so on and so forth. Here, the idea is that, and as you can see from the image on the right, where they're starting a race or a marathon, everyone starts from the same line. Everyone has the same conditions, if you will. The process is the same for everyone. Here, the appeal is to meritocracy, or at least the idea of meritocracy, the idea of a level playing field, of equal access, and so on. So this is in opposition to equality of outcome, and this is the ideal that equality of opportunities appeals to, the idea that it is meritocratic. So the next slide here is the discussion of political economy. Now, what do I mean by political economy? So when we talk about fairness and we talk about equality, we talk about human dignity, we talk about all of these concepts, we really are talking about what we are doing as a community that lives in the modern state or as a collective. And there are two, let's say, foundational concepts that define a lot of our political debates and discourse. On the one hand, there is individual liberty, which is just about the sovereignty of the individual rights, and how the state should be, if you will, respectful of an individual's rights and liberties. And then the second part, and is about collective good. So that's about the role of the state or the role of the community in realizing a collective good and intervening and in some sense contravening the individual's liberty. So in this context, we can think about equality of outcome in terms of the cost of equality of outcome is as a contravention to individual liberty. So an individual's dignity can be, if you will, compromised and sacrificed when we think about intervening in someone's life or intervening in a particular community so that we can achieve outcome. So we might think of that as a cost in some sense. But there's also a cost to equality of opportunity. Now, the main cost for equality of opportunity is that we're compromising the dignity of the human dignity of individuals, of individuals in society by completely, if you will, burying our heads in the sand with respect to the reality of or the context in which the political debate and political discussions are taking place. So here we've got the image on the right of two people, and one person is, even though they're starting on the same line, clearly they're not. This is not a fair race, or this is not a fair circumstance. You can't compare the two in terms of the way in which they are, the opportunity that they're given. So this is that there's a myth, if you will, that people are just born in the exact same circumstances, and that if we just give everyone the same equal opportunity, then individuals can make their individual choices. When in fact we know that we're all born into a particular context, and that context is highly determinate in terms of the options and the outcomes that we often find ourselves with or find ourselves in. So we need to think about theories of fairness in terms of context. So this is just to reiterate that at the most abstract level, there's a thought experiment, which is that this is called the veil of ignorance, which is that we should forget about our individual backgrounds and context. So we should degender ourselves, de-racialize ourselves, declass ourselves, so on and so forth. We should strip ourselves of all those kind of contexts. If we didn't have any awareness of the context that we come from, what kind of political system would we come out with? What kind of fairness would we commit ourselves to? I want to say that that kind of thinking is, one can critique it by saying, hang on a minute, context as king. We have to deal with the world as it is. We have to deal with concepts of fairness or the nature of parity or equality in a society by understanding how the society is at the time in order for us to make meaningful judgments. So we don't do political philosophy. We don't do theories of justice, theories of equality, theories of fairness in abstract. We do it very much in the world. And you're going to see that throughout this work, in particular in the case of AI and fairness, where it's very much about applied ethics. It's about ethics in the world, making tangible choices in a context that's real. So let me give an example. Even a concept like history, we need to take history into account. There are different concepts of history itself. This is just to reiterate just how contextual the discussions are. So one concept of history is that, look, we have a moral obligation to our to the generations coming before us. So this was a very generations coming, like our children and our grandchildren and so on and so forth. So there's a partnership across generations, a kind of Berkeleyan approach to fairness. So we have our concept of fairness is very much dependent on generations that are going to come in the future. A second concept of fairness is to say we have to address historical injustice. So we need to look backwards and say, hang on a minute, the way we are today, certain groups, certain demographics, certain historical events or processes or structures were in place which stop certain communities from accumulating wealth or accumulating know-how, or have created situations today which put them at a disadvantage. And we need to look back and think about that when we're addressing our history, our concepts of fairness today. So even the concept of history itself is very contentious, and you need to think about that when making decisions about fairness. And finally, to give the final example, the issue about scope. So, okay, we have a concept of fairness and we have some kind of understanding of context. Where do we apply it to? Are we applying it locally? Is this about me applying concepts of fairness in the context of my family? Is it regional? Is it about the cities we come from? Is it about the countries we are in? Is it international? Do I have the same fairness obligation to my neighbor as I do to somebody across the world in a completely different context? If not, why not? If so, to what extent do I have those obligations? And so on and so forth. So these are really contentious issues. This is not to say that we've answered all of them, but we should think about this. The issue about context is that it problematizes, it's not trivial to go from the concept or the ideas we have of fairness to applying that fairness in the world, because we have all of these layers and layers of context that we need to understand. So in this section, we've talked about human dignity, and we've discussed that as the foundational concept of fairness. Then we've talked about theories of fairness, which is just outcome and opportunity concepts. We've talked about where these concepts come from, where these ideas are from. And then we've kind of problematized that even if we have a theory of fairness, when we try to apply it, we need to think about political economy, and we need to think about the context. We need to think about fairness as it exists in the world. And we should take this section, part one, as I've said before, as a point of departure to think more deeply about these concepts and to go about and explore them yourselves, but also to understand that our concepts of fairness have deep philosophical foundations. Thank you.